time. So first, we're not even going to deal with the problem yet, so you can turn that over. And I should say right now, you can close your laptops too, because we won't be needing those today. So sorry. I know everyone loves their laptop, but there's no need for it. So we're going to not even deal with the problem to start. We're just going to talk about changed circumstances. Then we'll deal with figuring out what facts can go where. And then we'll get into the actual problem and look at the sample answer, and we'll go through it together to sort of analyze why it was written the way it was written. And then the last thing we'll do is you'll trade with each other at the very end your own written answer, just so you can see how it compares to what we just did. And it's really helpful, actually, to read someone else's writing, believe it or not, because then you can see, like, oh, I guess I could have said that differently, or maybe I could have said that more clearly. Then you start to understand what your professors are looking for when they read. So it'll be good. So the first thing we're going to do is just basically orient ourselves to where we are in the semester. So here I wrote on the board what we're doing, which is change circumstances, and then the issues that you've talked about in class that go in this area. So the first thing I want to point out is that one of the things that can be very overwhelming all semester long is you're getting all this information thrown at you, all these different issues, and it just seems like a big mess of information. And how do you tame that mess? Like, how do you make sense of it? And one way is to start figuring out which issues group together naturally. So that's why we're calling this changed circumstances, because that's a trigger for you on your final exam to think about what's going on in the fact pattern and ask yourself, is there any circumstance here that has changed? So last time it was different. Last time you guys were talking about the parole evidence rule, and you had things like the parole evidence rule, interpretation, good faith, things like that would all get grouped in there, because there you were talking about content that was either not clear or problematic somehow. So there you were getting the word that people were arguing over, or the term, and that would tell you on a fact pattern, oh, that's taking me over there and to that group of issues. Reading this fact pattern, you probably can tell there's no issue of that here. Like, no one's arguing over profitability or what a chicken is or any of that stuff. Here, they're all agreeing that there was a contract. They're just saying something has changed from the time we agreed to now. And that's the question, is what has changed and when did it change? And that's where we are. So when you see that on a fact pattern, then you know, like, okay, I'm here now, and these are the group of issues I need to worry about right now. So at least for then, you're focusing on that, and it helps you take some of the extra noise away. So now we've got these 5 things, and we need to make sense of them. And so we're going to do that because this will help you see how to go about outlining it. And just as a reminder, outlines are due next Tuesday. Sorry to bring up all these reminders, but you know your contract's outline, and torts or property, whichever one you're in, is due to your Dean's Fellow next Tuesday. So if you haven't outlined this yet, then this should be very helpful. Because when I say outlining, I think it can be kind of a misnomer. I don't necessarily mean the traditional IA, sub-issue 1, whatever. It could be a flow chart, it could be a drawing, it's whatever it is to you that forces you to take all that information and put it in some kind of order. And I'll come back to that after we sort of diagram this. But let's start out by just figuring out what is the central thing we need to first do. So we already know from class that we've got to start with formation. And then we go through the timeline from there. So contract formation is the key. So what goes before contract formation? We've got 5 choices here. What should I be putting on this side of the board that takes us to before? Yeah.
Mutual and unilateral mistake.
Right. So let's do this. Let's put them both here. And then, so naturally, that means the other 3 will go over here. So we're going to just put these over here. So we've got impossibility, impracticability, and then frustration of purpose. So you told me that these go in this order. Why is that? What is the thing about formation that we're talking about? How would you articulate that?
I'm not sure.
Well, so why does formation matter? What puts mutual mistake and unilateral mistake there and not there?
Oh, because that's the parties understanding well the contract is being put together?
Right, so here, there's a mistake at the time of the contract. So here, it's something that developed after. So that's a very important distinction. It does not mean that you can't argue both, as you'll see when we go through the problem. Sometimes the facts are vague enough that you're not sure which is which, but that's what you're looking for because timing is really critical to which one you talk about here. So now we need to populate what all these are. So let's start with mutual mistake. This is where we break it down into elements. And so let's go through and tell me what should I put under mutual mistake. What's first? I'm sure you all know. Yes.
At the time of the agreement, both parties must be mistaken.
So both parties are mistaken at the time of the agreement about existing facts. So that's essentially what you're saying. So that's both parties mistaken. What comes next?
It concerns the basic assumption of which the contract is made on.
Exactly. So basic assumption. Number 3. Yeah.
Material effect on the agreed upon exchange.
Right. Material effect. And number 4. Yes.
The party seeking invalidation has to show that he doesn't bring the risk of the mistake.
Right. So no assumption of risk. So those are our 4 elements. That's going into your outline. But of course, that doesn't tell us anything really. I mean, that tells us what they are, but whether we understand what they are, that's a different question. But that's where you now populate what's there with what you've done in class. So it's not just a matter of cutting and pasting all your notes into some document that's just formatted like an outline. It's actually about taking out facts and putting them where they belong. So both parties mistaken is maybe a little clearer, but the basic assumption can sometimes be tricky. And so you have cases that you read that talked about that. You talked about that in class. Those are the things that should be going here. So you could put rules from the cases that you read would go under basic assumption. Things in class that you discussed as other examples or as hypos, you can put under basic assumption. And that's how you start building your outline or flow chart or whatever it is. And so then we go over to unilateral and we do the same thing. And luckily, we actually don't have too much extra work because the first 4 elements of unilateral mistake are the same 4 elements of a mutual mistake. So that is really easy. So we'll just put same plus, there's a number 5. Does anyone know what the 5th element is? Yes.
Isn't it true that only one party is mistaken?
Yes, that's up here. You're right. So this isn't both parties. You're right. So this is one party. Thank you for correcting me. So there, it's the same idea, but the difference is that it's only one side is mistaken. So,
I thought that was
but there is still a 5th element though. So there's actually one extra thing. So you have the mistaken party, you have the other 3, and you have something else. Yes.
The other party has reason to know.
Right. So that what Professor Howland is grouping that. There's actually 3 things under there, but it's the fairness considerations. That's what he's calling it. So let's put fairness considerations. But then there are 3 subparts under that. But what he calls them is either the enforcement of the contract would be unconscionable. So unconscionable is the key word. Or the party knows or has reason to know of the mistake. Or has the fault, he caused the mistake, basically. It's his fault. So there's 3 things, but there, those were ors. So you only need one of those things under fairness to complete the list. So That's also a key word. And or are very important words when you're talking about elements, because here, under mutual mistake, these are all ands. You have to have all four, or you don't have a mutual mistake. Here, it's the party is mistaken, and the basic assumption, and the material effect, and the no assumption of risk, and the fifth element. But that fifth element, you have three different things, and only one of them is enough to prove the fifth element. So just keep that in mind. We're going to see that in our fact pattern and in our model answer, but that's a good distinction to remember. So then we need to do the same thing here. So under impossibility, there isn't much there. It's basically asking if the contract has become objectively impossible. Like, there's no way to do this thing. So there are really no elements under impossibility, but there are under the other two. So let's start with impracticability. What would come first? Yes?
Change after?
Correct. So change after formation. What's number two? You might want to pick up this answer key in a couple sheets paper.
Okay, good.
I'll put them right here for you. Yeah, number two?
I don't know if extreme and unreasonably difficulty and or expense falls under the change after formation, but it's part of it.
It is
One of
part.
the changes.
Yeah, exactly. It's number three, so I'm going to put it there. Extreme cost or difficulty, we'll say. And we don't have to do them in order. If you think of them out of order, that's fine. Yeah.
Like a supervening event that wasn't the fault.
Yes, I think you're getting at maybe the no assumption of the risk, perhaps. Is that what you're referring to?
No, so
Okay. Well, we'll put that forth then. And then the one we're missing is actually there too, the basic assumption. Yes, exactly. And then I'm putting a star down here about something called foreseeability. So just, we'll keep that in mind. We'll talk about foreseeability. I put a star there because foreseeability is not an element, but Professor Heilman, and sorry for my bad writing, but Professor Heilman talked to you about how foreseeability helps inform this conversation. So you do want that to make its way into your outline. Like, that's something you don't want to forget to include, but since it's not an element, I put a star because you can't satisfy the foreseeability element. It's just a reminder that you want to make sure you talk about it when you're talking about the other elements. So now we're going to do frustration of purpose, and what's the first element I should write up there, or any of the three? Yeah.
Principal purpose.
Right. So a principal purpose has been frustrated. Okay, what's number two or three?
It has to be substantial.
Substantial, yes. And then I heard someone say the supervening act, which I'm not sure is an actual element, though, as one of these three. There's actually a third, more specific element. Yes.
The purpose of frustrated is the basic assumption.
Right. So we can see this basic assumption keeps popping up. It's basically everywhere. We've got it under 4 of these. So that's good to see, because that means it makes your life a little bit easier, actually, since the same concept keeps coming up. It's not as bad as it seemed as far as things to remember. Now we've whittled it down here, where we have mostly similar elements. We just have to remember that for unilateral mistake, one party's mistaken, not both. And we have this 5th fairness consideration that we need to satisfy. And then here we can see that we've got basic assumption in both. And so it helps you, have to remember a little bit less. And so once you get the concept under one of them, it will fall into place in the others. So now we've laid that out. You basically have a visual of how an outline can start to come together. And then what we do is we apply the fact pattern to this. So before we even get to the model answer, we can just go through the fact pattern and start to say what goes here, what goes in each thing. So let's start with mutual mistake. The reason I start here is because since this repeats most of the elements and adds an extra, we might as well start with the one that has all the basics and then do the adding elements afterward, because it'll save you some time. And on an exam, you do want to think about that. You want to be efficient, get through as much as you can in the shortest amount of time possible. So we're going to start here, and I'm going to be asking you to tell me what goes here. So do we know for sure if this first element is satisfied for mutual mistake, that both parties are mistaken? And how do we know this? Yeah.
Well, it was the seller's sister or brother was on the board, and so we just don't know. There's a lot of facts that could go both ways.
Right.
If they knew that, if both parties knew that the hospital would ever close or not, because I mean, you can then argue that it was 80 years it's been open for, so they didn't think it was going to close down.
Right, and so you just said a very important thing, because we don't know for sure, and there's a lot of facts that go both ways. That's really important to remember, because you're often going to find that that's the case, and that's definitely the case in this problem. It's pretty vague what people know or don't know, when they knew and when they didn't know. And so if you're wondering, if you've already looked at that model answer, if you're wondering why we talk about so many of these issues, that's exactly why, because it's not that clear. So oftentimes we can come to an exam with our own assumptions, or we lean really strongly one way, but you want to try to be objective. And so you're totally right, we don't know for sure. So what you're saying is perfect. Here, the things you talked about would all go under both the argument that both parties knew, or both parties were mistaken, because there's enough facts there that make us go in that direction. So that's what we would want to talk about there. Now, and actually before we lay this out, we would need obviously a rule statement. So your rule statement is going to be building off of these elements. So you'll lay out what these are, and then within each one, you can explain further what each one means. Both parties mistaken, not that hard to explain perhaps, but basic assumption, maybe a little bit more tricky. Can someone articulate what that means? What is a basic assumption element? It's okay to take a stab at it. Doesn't matter if it's perfect. Yeah.
Isn't it a basic assumption that they had the event not happen?
Well, so yeah, it's basically the basic assumption. So there was a mistake about something, and that thing, it was a basic assumption that whatever was mistaken was important to this contract. So I think that's basically what you're saying, I think, but you're phrasing it a little bit more like what goes on the other side, because those are things you assume won't happen, because those are changes after. Here, these are changes at the time of. So it's not so much an assumption of a change that won't happen, because theoretically it happened at the time of, but it's an assumption, like in this case, it's the hospital. It's an assumption that the hospital would be there, and now the hospital won't be there. So now I just told you what goes there. But that's what the basic assumption is. And it's a subtle difference, and that's important to note, because when you're talking about basic assumption here, you can't just say, see what I said over there, because the basic assumption here is slightly different. So is that clear what it is over here, or, yeah? So the hospital is a good example. Like if they knew at the time that there wasn't going to be a hospital, that's a problem, because the basic assumption was that there would be a hospital. So then we can go to a material effect. And so how do we articulate what that is?
One question.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah,
going
no.
back to the second one.
Yes.
Could you also argue that the basic assumption was that the flower shop was going to be profitable for some time?
Well, you could argue that, but is the mistake that the flower shop wasn't profitable?
No.
So that's the reason you would stick with the hospital, because it doesn't help you necessarily with the
Yeah.
argument about the mistake.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So back to a material effect, how would you say what that is if you were writing this out? And you can use the example from the problem if it helps articulate what the element means. Yeah.
It's almost like the addition or omission of that particular thing or parameter changes the dynamic of the expected purpose.
Right.
It's a lot of words, but
No, but I mean that's good. Like it's good to try to articulate it because I think that helps focus you in on what to look for in the facts. So what facts would you say show you what you just told me?
in this instance, the mistake having material effect being, I don't want to say loss of profit because I feel like that's not protectable, but protected. But material effect, it changes the value, perhaps, of the business.
Yeah.
Changes the nature of the contract.
Yeah.
Instead of the current owner selling a profitable business, it's now the current owner unloading an unprofitable, potentially unprofitable.
Right. I think that's exactly right, and that's getting at what you were asking about. So that's actually where you would put your profitability discussion. And you're right that profitability maybe is a weak argument to fulfill that element, but that's okay because you have to have some argument, and if that's the best one that's in the facts, then that's the best one that's in the facts. And as it turns out here, that is the best one that we can go with. So the guy obviously was planning to, he spent $100,000 on this thing, he was expecting it to be profitable, and if this hospital closes and he loses money, that's a material effect for him. So that's what I would put there. Now, would you consider these first three very arguable, or do they seem like they pretty much lean one way, like what Professor Ryan would call a slam dunk?
Except for the first one.
You think the first one is?
Well, how would we argue both like unilateral and mutual? Because for the both parties mistaken, he's going to argue that the other person wasn't mistaken.
He is, but where will he argue that? Over here.
But what would be the argument for mutual?
So for mutual, I think the facts are vague enough that he can argue that they both knew because there is the information about the relative being on the board of the hospital. So it's possible that he actually knew. And then you're saying, what is the other guy?
For mutual, it would be the guy selling. He would argue that he didn't know, but the guy buying, he would argue that it wasn't mutual because he didn't know what the other guy knew. Right?
Well, yes, he would be arguing that here. But here you're trying to be more objective about it. Like, what would be the argument that they both just made a mistake? And you could say that maybe neither one of them knew because the facts don't say for sure that the guy selling knew, and you seem okay with that one, right? But you're saying the other guy, but the other guy really probably didn't know. The buyer probably had no clue. So it seems like we can argue mutual mistakes. So while there is a counter argument that we're going to do over here for the one party, for here it's pretty easy to at least argue that they were both mistaken. So it seems to me like your hunch that these two are slam dunks, I think probably are, and this probably is too. If you did on an exam argue both ways, I think what it would lead you to is to unilateral mistake. And you just want to make sure you don't skip mutual mistake altogether just because this seems weaker. And it probably is weaker, but it's not so weak that there's nothing to talk about. So just make sure you don't skip over it for anybody. Now, the no assumption of risk. What does that mean in the context of this problem? Is there any evidence that maybe there was an assumption of risk? Yes.
Yeah, there's specific language in the contract that he signed.
Right, and what did it say? You don't have to quote it, but like roughly, what did it say?
That the owner makes no representations of warranties whatsoever about the future.
Right. So that leans towards saying that maybe the other party assumed the risk, not the seller. But do we have maybe a counter argument here that we could make? Was anyone able to think of one? Yeah.
I don't know. I was thinking that because there was something about how it was a really old contract, and he was just like, "Oh, just use that one again." So maybe there's some argument about.
Yes. Exactly. Did anyone read that and wonder why that was there? I don't know. If that seemed odd to you and you didn't use it, that's a red flag. Highlight it and figure out where does this go? Because it goes somewhere and that's where it goes. It tells you something about the assumption of risk. Because if they used an old contract and just basically copied the terms, does that really mean that the other party agreed to this? Maybe it's just boilerplate language that no one really thought about, and so he didn't actually agree to it. So if you skipped that part, that's a thing where when you see a weird fact like that, highlight it in a different color or do something to it so that you keep it in mind that you talk about it. So we would have put those facts all here, and that kind of fills out assumption of risk. Now, you would do the same thing when you're making your outline. You would just use the cases you read for class, and that's what you would do with those facts. You would put them here in your outline because then it helps you remember, oh, that's what a basic assumption is. Like I can think of that example next time. Like I'll think of this hospital next time, and I'll remember what that means. So then we're going to go over to unilateral. So now, we don't need to really repeat ourselves for the middle two because they're basically the same elements, so that's nice, it saves us some time. For unilateral, we get to save some time too because of what you were saying, because we do have a counter argument for unilateral to say that actually only one side probably made a mistake here and the other side probably didn't. So that takes care of like the first four things, and then assumption of risk, it's the same thing too. Since we're still in the world of mistakes, we can carry over the same assumption of risk. So that just takes us to the fifth thing, which is the fairness consideration. And so here it's an or situation, so we need to look at whether any of those three could apply. They don't all have to, only one has to work, but do any of them work? So does anyone think any of them works? Did he cause the mistake? So if it's unilateral, do we think that Barlow has any argument there? I don't think so. No causing of the mistake. I'm sorry?
I just think it's unconscionable.
Yeah, why do you think that?
Because of the thing that I said where like he had a relative on the board and knew that the hospital would possibly close down, and that's why he went to get rid of this.
Yeah, I think that's a good argument for it being unconscionable. It kind of repeats a little bit of what we've talked about here. You can repeat a little bit of the assumption of risk part. Maybe that would make it unconscionable. So it's, again, not necessarily the strongest argument, but it's an argument. It's a plausible argument for the fairness thing. So you just want to remember you're trying to make an argument why this wouldn't be fair, and then the counter argument for why it would be. So do we have any questions about mistake? Yes?
Just to recap, the fairness considerations, the three are unconscionability, knew or should have known a mistake, and caused the mistake.
Right.
And both are or, so it's not.
Right. Was there another question? No. Okay. All right.
I'm sorry. It's knew or should have known.
Right.
Thank you.
Yes.
Does it matter which part you talk about first?
You mean here?
Yeah.
No, it doesn't. I mean, like one side would say this, one side would say that. Are you saying does it matter which side comes first? It doesn't matter as long as you keep it in order for yourself. The one thing you don't want to do is start confusing which party is making which argument. So whatever keeps it in straight for you is fine. Okay, so we checked all that off. So now we can move over to the after part, because these facts are vague enough that it's not necessarily clear that all this mistake was something that happened before. There could have been this thing that happened after, and maybe that's I don't know, more obvious that the hospital closed after they made this deal. So maybe this is where our minds would go to first, so maybe it was more difficult to think about that. Who knows? But we need to do this. Now, impossibility, we won't spend time on today because there's no facts here. We can't really say that he can't run a flower shop. So don't waste time. We won't waste time on that because we just can't do it. So let's go to impracticability. What's that?
No, because Professor Ryan, when she gave us like a little outline for our answer, she put impossibility there too. So she did? Just kidding.
It's in your rule statement, but there's nothing to say about it. I mean, you'll definitely mention it in your rule. Like, we put it up here because it's part of changed circumstances. So your big rule will have it, but when you go to your analysis, there's not anything to argue there. So we can move on to impracticability. And so so you're going to have a rule statement before this, which basically is built on your elements. So that's a good way to guide you in writing your rule. I know people have asked me oftentimes if you have to memorize it word for word, and no, you don't. We're not talking about it word for word. I'm not saying the rules word for word. You just have to talk about it in plain English, and if you hit these 4 elements in there, you've said the rule, so you can do it. So let's go to number 1. How would we argue that there was a change after formation? Because you need to do that because you need to distinguish it from mistake. So what would you say for that, since these facts are a little hazy? Yeah.
The hospital decided that it's going to close down.
Right, and when is it going to close down?
Right after the formation.
Right, I mean, you just want to make sure you point to the fact that it's after they made the contract, so it's a subsequent thing. So that's number 1. So basic assumption, we talked about this a little bit already, because here when we're talking about a basic assumption, we're talking a little bit differently because it's what someone over here asked. This is talking about a basic assumption that there wouldn't be a change. So this is not anymore about a mistake. Now we're saying we're in the world of changes after the contract, but someone assumed that there wouldn't be. What could you say from the facts to support that that was a basic assumption of this contract? Yeah.
That Marlowe said that Marlowe thought that he could repay back the loan in 4 years based on the profit. So he had a mental projection of what the profit stream would be, what he knew what it was, and he assumed what it would continue to be. So he made that basic assumption based upon the hospital being open.
Right. That's great. Yeah, those facts all support that finding, and that's really good to throw into your analysis. Because that's the because, like that's the why. Why is that satisfied? Extreme cost or difficulty is not too different from what you just said. You would add on that stuff, like the fact that he was going to pay this back, and so much of their money comes from this hospital business. So that could be part of it. And then what would we say about the assumption of the risks?
See above. Or the other element.
Well, you could do that, but I would talk a little bit more here than just see above, because it is similar, but you do want to repeat some of that argument here, because here you've got to remember that the assumption of the risk here is not that there wouldn't be a mistake. The assumption of the risk here is that there wouldn't be a change later. And what change? The hospital closing, because if it satisfies all these, we still need to determine that the assumption of the risk would be about what changed. So you want to make sure you point that out. Yes.
So 2 questions.
Yes.
So for impracticability, you're not an order and you need to satisfy all the elements in order to establish impracticability?
Yes.
Okay. And in addition, for a basic assumption of risk in the fact pattern, it did state that the guy, I don't remember his name, who purchased the flower shop, assumed that the flower shop would be there forever. He states that in the fact pattern. So can you say that he assumed, he went ahead and assumed the risk in purchasing the flower shop, knowing that the hospital was going to be there, but that's a risk that he took as a business matter?
Yes, you can throw that in there. You definitely still want to talk about the contractual language and the the no warranty
Well, the
stuff.
contractual language had a clause that said that they weren't responsible for
Right.
any kind of profit that
Right.
weren't made during that time frame. So
Right.
is that the main argument to address the basic assumption of risk, or would that be a valid argument to say what would the guy buying the flower shop argue in reference to a basic assumption of risk?
Right. So first, in reference to what you were talking about, that if you thought it would be there forever, that's a good fact to use under the basic assumption.
Right.
Right. So that we know. Now you can reuse it. It's not like facts expire. So if that fact helps your argument that he was not assuming the risk, or he was, which it sounds like you're saying, that shows that he was assuming the risk. As long as your because makes sense, that's what matters. And it sounded like it did, because you were saying he assumed the risk because that meant, it could take, you can't predict what happens all the way into the future. If
Right.
he
If
thought,
you're buying the business
Right.
in reliance to another. A hospital is not a business
Right.
per se, but in reliance to another factor that you think might contribute to it.
Right.
So in turn, that business relies not on the business in itself, but the outside incoming
Right.
profits that are coming onto it.
Yes, and so if you say all that, you've supported that, and it makes more sense that you're using it there. You'd still use the fact up here for basic assumption, that's fine. But if you say all the rest of that explanation for why you're also going to talk about that here, then that's good.
Because I was really confused in the analysis to use. I mean, I understood the element by definition, but I was confused in how to address it in the sense that satisfies the
Right.
How to differentiate between basic assumption and assumption of risk.
Right, and they are different, obviously. So does that help clear it up?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So in all of this, foreseeability comes into play, and you're touching on that too. So what you're talking about is, was this really foreseeable? I mean, that's essentially another way of phrasing what you're saying. Like, if he thought this was going to last forever, is it really foreseeable that a hospital would never close, or is it more foreseeable that a hospital would close eventually? Nothing lasts forever.
Right.
So that's a good example, actually, of how to weave foreseeability in, because foreseeability especially informs basic assumption and assumption of risk, because the basic assumption that, let's say, this hospital will be open forever and his business depends on it, that's a question where you want to ask yourself, like, is that reasonable? Could we imagine that something would never, ever close or be open forever? If something is really foreseeable, then the idea is that they are kind of taking on the risk. If it's not foreseeable, then that's telling you, like, this is probably a huge surprise to the normal person. If it's a big surprise, how can we say he's taking on the risk? So that's how I would weave that into this conversation. So we start foreseeability, just remember to talk about it, and that's what you just did, so that's great. Does that make sense, how we would weave foreseeability in without necessarily making it an element? Okay, so far, good. So then, bless you. Let's go to frustration of purpose. So now we have a slightly different equation here of elements that we need to satisfy. So again, you're going to have your rule statement built on these elements, and then we'll go one by one. So let's talk about the principal purpose being frustrated. Any arguments as to whether that's satisfied or not satisfied? Yeah.
One argument is that I said it wasn't satisfied is the fact that you can still run a flower shop without a hospital.
Right.
But then the other side is, he said that the profitability went down, you can't compete, if the hospital runs down, that's where the customers come from, so.
Well, let's focus on what you're saying is the principal purpose.
Okay.
What is the principal purpose?
Run the flower shop.
Right.
Solve
So, to have the flower shop, but how else could you describe it? Does the hospital play into that at all?
No.
Did he buy it because he thought it did, maybe?
Yes.
Right. So that needs to factor into this, because his argument, remember, one side's trying to say that there was a principal purpose that was frustrated. So what do the facts imply that maybe he bought this flower shop specifically because it was tied to the hospital? Maybe. It's possible. It seems worth mentioning. You raised your hand?
Yeah, he's purchasing the Good Samaritan Forest shop right next to the Good Samaritan Hospital. Mm-hmm. So, the implication being that while not, like, mutually well, not associated business-wise, that there's this, like, intangible connection between the two, and that if his principal purpose was to be operating the Good Samaritan Forest shop, it would rely on, in some which way, on there being a Good Samaritan hospital to serve, just by virtue of the name itself. And while the name, it's not like a slam dunk argument, it's
It is. It's an argument that I would actually consider putting here, though, under substantial. And this is where this gets a little hazy, because what is the difference between these two? It's not really that easy to tell. So here, one way to think about it is here you're trying to identify what is the principal purpose. One side is going to say that it's the buying a flower shop tied to this hospital. One side's going to say it's buying a flower shop. The rest of it is just extra. The substantial, though, I think does tie into the name, because we know that it was frustrated because the hospital's closing. So that part, it's easy enough to say that this purpose was frustrated if it was a principal purpose, but was that frustration substantial? That's the next question. And if you use the facts you were talking about up here, you're not left with anything to put here. And so that's one way to look ahead at the fact and see like what goes where. If you're finding a hard time filling this substantial element out, then you can look back at what you put up here because maybe you put too much up here. Maybe you can spread it out. And that's what I would suggest for this, because then you could say that the fact that this thing was called the Good Samaritan Flower Shop means the hospital closing is probably a really substantial problem for him because he bought this flower shop with the same name. Does that help a little bit breaking that down? And then the basic assumption, what would we say here? So we've got a lot of the recycled arguments really under here for the basic assumption. And so you can reiterate the disclaimer that was in the contract, the things that we talked about earlier, all go under a basic assumption. So that gets us through the facts. I want to still go through the actual answer so we can actually look at the answer. So let's go through that now. And I'm going to put it up on the overhead. Yes. No, thank you.
In order to prove that the other party knew or had reason to know, in this situation, do you think it's a good analysis to state that in the fact it said that Sam, whose cousin worked in the hospital for so many years,
Right.
Would have some information of the hospital's closure. So do you think that would be sufficient to establish the knew or had reason to know element?
I think it would definitely be something to talk about there because that implies, I mean, nothing says that he definitely knew, but that certainly implies that he might have known, or maybe he had reason at least. So yeah, I think that's a good thing to point out. Okay, so what I wanted to do is go through this answer key because this is basically visually what an answer should look like. So I know a lot of the materials that Professor Ryan gives you has the I marked up or the R, the IRAC is noted or the elements are underlined. And she's only doing that really to point those out. But in an actual exam essay, you wouldn't do that. You would want to write it more like an actual essay. So this is what it would look like. But I want to go through it and let's look at how this actually does do all the things that we've been talking about. So first up here, this is just a general rule and issue statement. So I'm going to put general I and R. So this is just stylistically, we're just setting up this whole answer. It's very generalized. You can see we're not getting into the nitty-gritty yet. We're just basically laying out the basic question and a very general rule that there's no excuses for non-performance normally, but that we have these few justifications that are available. That's all we're doing there. Then we're doing what we did on the board. So then we're doing the split. And we're saying that there's a world of issues before formation and there's a world after. And that's why we have this heading right here. That's important because you're signaling to your professor, I'm going to deal with that world first, then I'm going to come to this world. So you're letting your professor know, I know there's a difference, and you want to make sure you do that. And then we go through. So then here we've got the I for IRAC. That first paragraph is our issue statement. And you notice it doesn't have to be written as whether so-and-so and such. It can just be a couple sentences that lay it out. And then we've got our rule is the next paragraph. So that's what we've got there. And under the rule, I'm just going to point out the four. So we've got the rules for mutual mistake. So I want to point out we're starting in the mutual mistake. So we've got the both parties right here, and then that they're mistaken about existing facts. And then we've got the second element, that the mistake concerns a basic assumption, so we've got that there. And we've explained a little more on which the contract was made. And then 3 is right here, the mistake has a material effect. And then 4 is the party seeking avoidance did not assume the risk. So when I was saying earlier, your rule statement comes out of the elements you've outlined, I really meant it. I mean, we're just putting that into a sentence, basically. And then the nice part about that is you just go back the other direction now and just deconstruct it to do your analysis. So we've got analysis all over here. All this is our analysis. So let's look at how we followed the rule. We've got one, both Barlow and Stewart, so we're dealing with the both first. Here we've got the second part, that's the basic assumption. And then the material effect we've got right there. So we did the first three in one paragraph. The reason we did that is because, as we talked about, those are kind of slam dunks. There isn't too much to say. And if you were hesitant to do that and you started by doing a paragraph for each, that's okay. But once you start your answer, you'll probably see that your answer for each one is pretty short. And then that's a clue that maybe you want to just combine it all together and make it one paragraph for the easy parts, and then save the big paragraph for the assumption of the risk. And that's what we did in the second paragraph, and that's the number 4 from our rule statement. So there's number 4, and then there's number 4. Or there's number 4. And then we ended with our conclusion right here. So we IWrapped it. Now, I do want to point out under the assumption of the risk part that we mentioned that there's a disclaimer. We said how some courts give conclusive effect to such disclaimers. So you're getting into the fact that for some courts, what we talked about, the disclaimer is enough to say you assume the risk. And then we switched to other courts, however. So that's where you're signaling to your professor, there's a counter argument here though, and I want to get into that next. So you say that others say that boilerplate disclaimers don't work, and notice that we've got a because right there, which helps explain why. And then there's another because here, because we're expanding it on a little bit more about why there's no meaningful assent to the disclaimer, because what we talked about, it was borrowed from another thing, and that's not a really strong sign that the party meant to make this deal. And so we've got our IRAC for mutual mistake. Yeah.
Would it be alright if, I guess not, but I sort of did subheadings for each element, and that's how I did my analysis, was in that format. I had a subheading for
like 1,
correct.
2, and 3. It's
Yeah.
okay. I mean, you're not gonna. It's not a. There's nothing wrong with doing it that way. It's just sometimes when you have 3 or 2 elements that are really satisfied, and you only have a sentence for it, it might be stylistically an easier read because you want to try to get your answer to look like an essay and not like a bunch of bullet points. So if you find that you have just one sentence on each, you can just delete those headings and maybe combine them. But it's not wrong either, for that matter.
Yeah. I'm just, because like for the parole evidence rule, we sort of broke it down into elements.
Right.
And so I know there isn't one universal format.
Right.
So just trying to determine like where to apply that format in particular exams.
Yeah, and I mean, this is where you have to use your discretion, and like, if you feel pretty confident something is satisfied, you would just collapse them into the one paragraph like we did here. If you're wavering, it's not wrong to break them out, it just might look a little less essay-like,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, so then let's go to the next page. So then we've got unilateral mistake, and we did the same thing here. So here, our first sentence is the I, and this shows you how for this one, we did it a little bit differently to try to address the fact that different people have different writing styles. So here, we didn't make one paragraph for the issue, we just made the first sentence be the issue statement, and then the rule statement starts there. That's okay too. And then we went ahead and explained the rules. So we said it would be unconscionable, so that was element number 1. Well, so we didn't repeat, obviously, the ones that are in common. We went to the fairness one. And so that's number 1, but it's or number 2, or number 3. So we're basically saying it's one party, but it's the same other elements, and then this extra thing are the ors, and we just need to see if we satisfy any one of those. And then here we've got our analysis, and we tackled them the same way. So here we talk about why it's not satisfying that. Stored new, we're dealing with there, and then the bearing the risk of the mistake is right there. So that's how we did it in the same order. And then our conclusion, we did like a mini conclusion here because we're still in this world of mistakes before or at the time of formation, and so that's where our conclusion is. But it's still IRAC. It looks a little different. It's just 2 paragraphs, but it's still, you can still find the IRAC in it. Then we're going to go to after formation, and our transition sentence is our issue statement at the same time, and then we've got a big rule paragraph right there. And so we're talking about the changes in circumstance after the contract is our first element, then which affects the basic assumption is our second, and then the extreme cost or difficulty is the third, right there, and then assuming the risk is our fourth. So you can see how we just put it into a paragraph and laid it out, and then we break it back down under our analysis. And we have 2 analysis paragraphs, so this is really A1 here, where we talk about the changed circumstance after the contract was formed. That was first. Then we talk about the basic assumption, matching where it is in our rule at second. Then the extremely costly goes third, and it spills onto the next page where we also, it's extremely costly or extremely difficult. And just to point out that because, like whenever you can throw that in there, it's a good reminder to yourself to explain why you're saying those things. And then we've got, here is our analysis paragraph 2. And so we've got basically now here the same counter argument. So when you have the time to read this, what you're going to see is that the paragraph A1, we did that as all the arguments one side would do, and we did A2 as all the arguments the other side would do. I know people often ask, like, how should we break that up? So we broke it up differently for you. In unilateral or in a mutual mistake, we didn't do it that way. We kind of mixed it all together. In this one, we did one paragraph was all his strong arguments for the elements on one side. On the other paragraph, we did the counter argument. So just to show you, we're covering basic assumptions there. We're covering the financial hardship or difficulty there. We're covering the assuming of the risk there. So when you go back and read this answer, read unilateral mistake and mutual mistake, thinking about how we did those two. It doesn't mean you have to do it one way or the other, but different people have different styles, so pay attention to that because it'll give you some hints on how you might want to write out your answers. And then we have our conclusion right here. And then frustration of purpose, same thing. The first sentence was the I, the rest of it was the R, and we did the main purpose, first element, was frustration was substantial, second element, and the basic assumption was the third. And so we have like a big A paragraph of stuff, like basically all here. And so we have the main purpose, we have the frustrated, that purpose, the substantial is the second element. And then here is where we got into the basic assumption. So here we tackled it like we tackled mutual mistake, where we saved the big discussion one for a separate paragraph. And then we concluded right here. And then this last sentence is kind of the tidy final wrap-up conclusion. It sort of mirrors your general introduction part and the end. If only it were that easy, of course. So now I want to ask you guys to please trade your answer with the person next to you, just so you can basically, if you would pick whichever issue you want, just pick one issue and mark it up with the IRAC and underline like we did the elements and number of them and in the rule and underline the same things in the answer or in the analysis so that you can see how they correlated. And if you're having trouble finding it, that's okay. You can just note that down. And we'll only do that for a few minutes, so you don't have very long. Yeah.